I like the dark. It's friendly.
The UK has a rich history of spiritualism and mediumship, and is there anything more quintessentially British than a wet afternoon? I love a rainy day, and what better way to spend an afternoon by watching Séance on a wet afternoon? How many times am I going to say the word afternoon in this video? It's a mystery. A story of séances, kidnapping, murderous intent, but ultimately the story of a woman so traumatized by a tragedy that she loses touch with reality. And her husband, through wanting to care for his wife, allows himself to be swept up in her scheme to prove her psychic abilities. Based on the book by Mark McShane, which I haven't read. If you have, please let me know in the comments if you think it's worth seeking out. This adaptation was written for the screen by director Bryan Forbes. It stars Richard Attenborough, Kim Stanley, and Nanette Newman, who I didn't realise until I did some research for this video, was married to the director. Séance on a Wet Afternoon is one of those British films that's highly regarded and yet not often mentioned when discussing horror, which is interesting because any time a new film about ghosts comes out, everyone's falling all over themselves to mention The Innocents. And rightly so, of course, it's brilliant, but considering all the recent films about séances, Ouija boards, mediums, no one mentions Séance on a Wet Afternoon. But perhaps that's because there's some ambiguity as to what's going on in terms of the supernatural. Anyway, this psychological thriller nails the modern Gothic, and while its plot is genuinely gripping, the film is a bit more of a character study.
It's all right, my precious, no. No more.
On a rainy day in London, in a dark room, faces and hands illuminated by candlelight, a suburban Victorian home is the setting for this psychological thriller. Myra is a medium who believes the spirit of her dead son connects her to the other side. Her husband, Billy, a mild-mannered and quiet man, supports her beliefs, and with her persuasion, he's talked into a scheme that involves kidnapping a child. Myra thinks that by borrowing a child and then providing the information to where she's being held will prove her psychic ability. We assume that Myra is simply play acting when she's leading her séances. Even if you believe in mediums and psychic ability, we can see pretty quickly that Myra is somewhat disturbed. However, at the end of the film, it's heavily implied that Myra finally did make contact with her dead son. With a haunting score by John Barry and beautiful cinematography from Jerry Turpin, who was the cinematographer on Peeping Tom, the atmosphere is thick right from the start of the film, and it's totally immersive. I found an interview with director Bryan Forbes where he talks about being convinced that the film would be a flop.
Then Dickie and I made Séance on a Wet Afternoon, which I thought was going to be a failure.
Did you?
Yeah, I got on the boat because I was going to do King Rat. And when I finished cutting it, and before it opened in London, I got on the boat, got on the Queen Mary and thought, I won't be here when it's a disaster.
Really?
He was right in the sense that it was a box office failure, but it got some pretty good reviews at the time. Richard Attenborough won a BAFTA for his performance, and Kim Stanley was nominated for an Oscar, losing to Julie Andrews in Mary Poppins. And speaking of Kim Stanley, Séance on a Wet Afternoon is notable for its rare lead performance from the acclaimed theatre actor. She's worthy of her own video, to be honest, because modern audiences haven't heard of her, but according to those who saw her on stage, her raw form of method acting made her electric to watch. Both Attenborough and Stanley do an incredible job of making these two characters sympathetic despite their pretty nasty scheme. Apparently casting the part of Myra was particularly difficult. Deborah Carr and Simone Signoret were both offered the part and declined. According to an article on horrifiedmagazine.co.uk, before Stanley joined the film, Bryan Forbes, apparently, considered recasting the two characters as men in a homosexual relationship, offering the parts to Tom Courtenay, who accepted, and Alec Guinness, who declined. I would love to see that version of the story. Attenborough is quoted as saying, "The complexity of dramatic impression vital to the credibility of Myra was hard to find. Also, an intellectual ability to follow and understand the character. I don't believe Simone could convey as Kim did the otherworldliness which this woman inhabited in her private fantasies." I remember thinking that Séance on a Wet Afternoon would make a great play, considering that the majority of the film takes place in the house. And in doing research for this video, I discovered that it's actually been made into an opera. There's also a Japanese TV movie called Séance that was based on the film, although from what I've read, it changes the plot a fair bit. It's somber, nuanced, tragic, and genuinely has you on the edge of your seat at times. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. It's available to stream on the BFI player, the Criterion Channel streaming service, Mubi, and something called Just Watch, which I've never heard of before. Thanks for watching, folks. Do no harm, take no shit, and stay spooky.
I'm going to give the people what they want. Sensation, horror, shock. Send them out in the streets to tell their friends how wonderful it is to be scared to death.